Hello and welcome. Today is International Women's Day, as you may be aware, and to celebrate, we are talking to the inspirational Katy Styles. At Healthwatch, we've been lucky enough to work with Katy many times to help improve services for carers and also people with motor neurone disease in Kent. She's an absolute inspiration to us here at Healthwatch, and I'm sure she will be to you as well. Welcome, Katy.
Oh, thank you, Phil. It's lovely to be here, and especially on International Women's Day. I'm really privileged, so thank you for inviting me.
We are in the most lucky position to kind of know lots about you already. But for our viewers, can you explain who you are and what you do every day?
Okay, so there's two sides to my life. I'm an unpaid carer to my husband, Mark, who has a rare form of motor neuron disease called Kennedy's disease. And I've been his carer now full time for coming up 6 years. I'm also a carer at the moment for my mum, who's elderly and had some little mini strokes, and so needs a bit of support over the pandemic. And she lives in Maidstone on her own, so sort of I've been shuttling back and forward a bit there. And then in any of my spare time, I run my own campaign called We Care, which is for unpaid carers in the whole of the UK. It's a digital campaign mainly, grassroots. It's led by carers for carers, and we're just trying to get things better for carers. And then I'm also a trustee of the Motor Neuron Disease Association and a campaigner for them. So in any spare time, I campaign to make services better for people with MND in Kent and beyond.
Well, I mean, thank you for giving up the time to come and chat to us because obviously you're very, very busy. Being a carer during COVID must have been hard. Can you tell us a bit about what the actual experience was like for you over the last year?
Yeah, no, it has been, and I think it's important to point out that I'm just one of 150,000 carers in Kent that have probably had, as tough a time and even tougher. So, I'd like to say that first. The initial lockdown was really, really difficult because as a carer, you build up support through your networks and through friends and family and through organisations that you come into contact, and that just went overnight. And sort of managing without that was really, really tricky. And added to that, this is where my campaigning comes in.
Right.
People with MND weren't on the government shielding list at that time. And nobody could believe that because obviously if somebody with MND who has respiratory problems had COVID, then that wouldn't be a great outcome. So we were campaigning really, really hard from March right round to May to try and get government to change its mind. And they didn't. But what we were able to do then for 5,000 people with MND in the UK was to get them to self-register in the end. And that meant we then had access to things like priority shopping online. Before that, I hadn't got any ability to shop online. So we were having to find local shops and businesses that could just deliver boxes of vegetables and bits and pieces to us on a sort of ad hoc basis. So that was really, really tricky. I think things then got a little bit better, but our lockdown wasn't all full of TikTok videos and sourdough starters and Netflix. It was really about survival and just managing the best that we could. And then, we got into jigsaws, which many people did, which was
Yeah.
lovely. And we saw some things, there were some positives. So we got to see some films that the National Opera and the National Theatre were doing. And also we got to watch Chester Zoo quite regularly. So that was lovely, seeing the animals on that, because these are all things that we could never go to because my
Exactly.
husband's
Yeah.
disabled. And so, from an accessibility point of view, that was great. And as certain things eased off during the summer, we didn't really ease off and notice any difference. We were able to go outside, but we were still very, very cautious. And so we weren't part of the eating out to help out scheme or anything like that. I think by the time we'd got to, round to sort of October and November, and when Kent was put in lockdown again, that was pretty grim, wasn't it? And across Christmas, deciding, what our plans were very modest, but we couldn't even do those. So yeah, and the cold and the weather has been pretty awful, hasn't it? Because you can't get outside and you can't go for walks and get a takeaway coffee. That's all I'm really dreaming of now, is having a takeaway coffee on a bench with one of my friends. Would just be fantastic.
Sounds blissful. Sounds blissful. Have you managed to get the vaccine yet? Has your husband managed to get the vaccine yet? I'm guessing, would your mum be of an age where she's already had that? How do you stand with vaccines at the moment?
Yes, and initially, so the vaccine, my mum is in her 80s, so was one of the first called. So that was great. But then we discovered that she couldn't actually have the vaccine because she's very allergic to some things, and so we had to wait for the AstraZeneca's vaccine to come around, and then she was able to have that. So it was really sort of distressing at the time, being rung up, told you could have it, and then not, that was quite hard to deal with. And my husband's had his first one, which again is great. And I sort of there was a sigh of relief all round when he'd had his. We live in a very small rural part of Kent near Canterbury, and GP's been brilliant. And then I got my vaccine a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, we've been very lucky, and it's worked well for us.
At Healthwatch, we've been working with you to raise awareness of how carers might be finding it hard to get their vaccine. Did you want to tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Yeah, no. Well, as a campaign, we noticed very early on, from about Christmas onwards, when government was mentioning about carers and vaccine, it was as a footnote. And so that wasn't always communicated very well. We're actually in priority 6, which we've got round to now. But unless you went down into the great detail around that, you wouldn't notice that unpaid carers were there. So I sort of started to inquire and ask the CCG, the Clinical Commissioning Group, at that point, whether they would change their newsletters and their websites to make sure that it was clear for carers that you could have your vaccine then. And thanks to Healthwatch's involvement, they have. So I'm really, really phenomenally pleased about that. But prior to that, it meant that we had to make sure that what we were saying was correct. So we had to ask some questions in Parliament in advance to make sure that, unpaid carers really were in this priority 6 point. The problem has also been that we don't have a register of unpaid carers. We don't have them in any of the countries across the UK. And so the only way of identifying carers officially is through carers allowance, and not every carer receives carers allowance. So government said, well, you can go to your GP and register with your GP, and then they will know that you're a carer. And a lot of carers thought that they were registered with their GP because of the number of times that they go with the person that they care for. But that's not necessarily the case. So there's a whole piece of education work, not only to carers themselves to say, go to your GP and make sure that you are registered, but also with the GPs themselves, which is again where Healthwatch came in, because sometimes, GPs are very hard pressed at the moment and you don't want to be wasting their time. But also, on the other hand, you've got to get staff to understand that carers are there because of their caring role and not because of the age that they are or the person that they're caring for is. So, that's really important, and that they are unpaid and won't have a letter saying that they are a carer. So all of those points make it doubly difficult for carers to get their vaccine. So having it sort of stated on websites and by Healthwatch and things like that has made it much easier. And that's what my campaign recently has been about, just trying to get that across lots of different parts of England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, because the guidance is all different in all different areas. So that's not easy.
It's not the only thing you've been campaigning about, though, is it? Tell us more about some of the other work that you do.
So within the Motor Neuron Disease Association, we've been campaigning locally for an improvement in respiratory services. So we've helped purchase, that's the East Kent group of the Motor Neuron Disease Association has recently purchased a piece of equipment, a blood gas monitoring piece of equipment, which people with MND can now go to the hospital and not have to traipse all the way around the hospital to get to this piece of equipment and the nurse.
You've got a specialist nurse in East Kent as well,
Yes,
haven't
so
you?
there's that. And then also the second part is that, once the pandemic is over with this respiratory change in commissioning, we should be able to get the nurse to go out to people so that they don't have to come into the hospital, which is, a big, big issue. So there's that. And then with the other caring as well, we ran a really big campaign over Carers' Rights Day, which is in November, which was a sticking plaster campaign, because we feel like sticking plasters holding everything together a lot of the time. Those sticking plasters we actually made craft sticking plasters out of fabric and felt, and sent 100 kits around the country for carers to make and then send to their MPs to remind them what a tough time that they'd been having in the pandemic. And following that, we had lots more questions about unpaid carers in parliaments and people wearing We Care badges for my campaign. So that was really, really great as well.
Sounds
Yeah.
fantastic. I mean, there are obviously going to be a lot of other people, as you said. There are such a high level of people who are unpaid carers who maybe even don't realise they're actually technically a carer. They just do what they do because they're in that situation. What would your message be to other people who find themselves in that situation and other carers who might be actually watching this now?
So that is the first point, is to recognize that you are actually a carer. And then once you have recognized that, so that you're not, as I'm just going to say, you're not just a wife or a husband or a daughter or a son caring for somebody, or a friend or a partner, or a parent, that you are a carer, and that allows you to access some help. So there's carer support organisations that are there to provide you with help. It also allows you to access some benefits. It allows you to access carers assessment, which is there for you and for you alone. It's to assess how your life has changed because of your caring role. And that's really, really valuable. And the more people that ask for a carers assessment and have that, the better. But also, if you've recognised that you're a carer from what I've been saying, and that you can get your vaccine earlier because you realise, you're not waiting for your age group, then, that's a win as well. So I'd also like to say that, unpaid carers, we all feel pretty much isolated and alone, but there are lots of digital campaigns like mine. There's digital communities online. There's all sorts of things. So once you start looking and type in the word carer, you'll find all sorts of support available.
You have the stage now. Is there anything you would like to say to the decision makers who might be watching this as well? People who actually make the decisions. You have the floor, Katy.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like some clarification over the term carer, because before the pandemic, carer meant us. And now, because of Clap for Carers, it's got conflated to mean, healthcare professionals and social care workers that are paid. And actually, carer means us. So, that's the very first thing. I think also it's really important to note that, between us all, every day we've provided £56 million worth of care during the pandemic. That's what it's been worth. So, I'd like to ask them what they're doing to support us, and how they will open back, some respite services and some mental health help that obviously some of us are going to need sooner rather than later. And then finally, if they are changing any service, that they involve carers. right at the very start,
Yeah.
because the more that we talk and explain about how a service impacts us and the people that we care for, the better that service will be. So co-production and co-design and, you know, advocacy from places like Health Watch all help to make services better, and therefore, you know, it's a better use of money and better provision, and we all win. So that's what I'd like to say.
Katy, thank you so much for joining us on International Women's Day. Today is about celebrating strong women and their achievements and supporting people to take action for equality, whether they're female or male, you know, supporting people to take action for equality. And I don't think we could have picked a better person to actually spend this time with. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Phil. I've really enjoyed it. And happy International Women's Day to everyone out there.